In the evening of April 18th, 1912, as the RMS Carpathia arrived at Pier 54 in Lower Manhattan, thousands impatiently awaited the disembarkation of the survivors of the Titanic disaster. For many gathered that night, the fates of their loved ones were about to be revealed as slowly 712 individuals walked down the gangway. One of the few going up the gangway that night was William Alden Smith, a United States Senator who had taken upon himself the responsibility of organizing a proper government inquiry. He carried on board a subpoena for none other than J. Bruce Ismay. If he was ever to determine what really happened aboard Titanic, Senator Smith would need to speak to the man closest to her. As will we. Welcome to Witness Titanic, a new Titanic podcast where we interview witnesses of her great story, from modern Titanic experts to even the survivors of this infamous sinking. Like the century-old inquiries that came before us, we may never fully determine what really happened on the night of April 14th, 1912, but you may be surprised to find how close our efforts will bring us to Titanic herself. My name is James Penca, and as the chairman of this inquiry, I welcome you back to our investigation. In episode 1, we covered the very basics of why Titanic existed in the first place. The beginning is, after all, a very good place to start. Before we call our very first witness of this podcast, we should first go over what we know about this disaster. Not what we've learned from movies and books and Facebook, but the indisputable facts of the case that we can state with confidence before we ask our witnesses to dive deeper. The facts are these. The RMS Titanic was a steam-powered ocean liner designed to transport passengers, cargo, and mail across the Atlantic Ocean. She was owned and operated by the Liverpool-based White Star Line and built in Belfast, Ireland by shipbuilding firm Harland and Wolff. The 882-foot-long ship was divided into 16 watertight compartments, was given a double bottom, was equipped with state-of-the-art wireless radio equipment, among many other safety features meant to keep Titanic afloat after enduring any likely collision or mishap. She was also equipped with 20 lifeboats, which exceeded the lifeboat requirement set by the British Board of Trade. Upon completion, she sailed for Southampton, England, where she would begin her maiden voyage as one of the safest ships ever built. At noon on April 10th, 1912, the ship departed Southampton, and after calling in Cherbourg, France and Queenstown, Ireland to take on more passengers, cargo, and mail, Titanic began the transatlantic portion of the voyage, carrying a total of 2,208 passengers and crew. Just 4 days later, on April 14th, 1912, around 11:40 p.m., an iceberg was spotted dead ahead by Titanic's lookouts, and though an evasive maneuver was attempted, the ship was not able to avoid an collision with the berg. Roughly 2 hours and 40 minutes later, Titanic disappeared beneath the surface, taking with her 1,496 lives. The remaining 712 survivors took to Titanic's lifeboats and were rescued a few hours later by the Cunard liner Carpathia and brought to New York City. As I mentioned in episode 1, virtually every other fact about Titanic can be debated or discussed further. We could sit here and talk for episodes and episodes and episodes about, was Titanic going too fast? Was she built incorrectly? Were the lookouts not given binoculars? Were there not enough lifeboats? Were the lifeboats loaded correctly? There's even people who debate whether or not Titanic's name was Titanic. Conspiracy theories. Oh no. So there's so much more to discuss and debate. And who better to begin that discussion than our first witness, someone who literally witnessed it all. Bruce Ismay could not be more valuable to the 1912 inquiries, our 2024 inquiry, or your own personal inquiries you may have going. He was present for the conception of Titanic, the design process, the building process, the launching, the departure from Southampton, Cherbourg, Queenstown, the disaster itself, and perhaps nobody straddled the line between passenger and crew quite like Ismay, a fact that would essentially ruin his life. He is known as the coward. He is the handlebar mustached villain of the Titanic story. In every movie or play about Titanic, he is the antagonist. Is he really to blame for this disaster? Did he push Titanic to go faster? Did he cowardly board a lifeboat? Does he deserve to be known as J. Brute Ismay? Let's find out. Before we dive into the testimony, a few notes for everyone. We will be focusing today and most episodes going forward on the United States inquiry. There is far too much to digest if we looked at the thousands of questions asked of Ismay on both sides of the Atlantic. And to be honest, there is a lot of overlap and redundancies between the two. So for now, we will stay in the United States. Perhaps once we've heard from all 86 U.S. witnesses, we shall venture across the pond. Also worth keeping in mind, there is not much organization to the line of questioning in the United States inquiry. It's essentially Senator Smith asking the witnesses questions, but there are other senators that chime in from time to time. As a group, they may speak on lifeboats for a few pages, then jump to mail contracts, and then talk about the iceberg collision, then jump back to how the ship was built. So there's really no chronological order there. And then what's worse, Ismay is questioned on 2 separate days of the U.S. inquiry, on day 1 and on day 11. And on day 11, they ask him new questions, but they also ask him some of the exact same questions. And in some of them, his answers are even slightly different. So what I've done for this podcast, for this episode and future episodes, I've taken every bit of Ismay's United States testimony. I pulled out fascinating questions and equally fascinating answers and placed them in an order of some sort so we can digest it in a better way. By the end of the episode, we really should have a very personal and authentic idea of what Ismay actually witnessed. So without further ado, I will ask Mr. J. Bruce Ismay to come forward and take the stand. To kick off our day of questioning with Mr. Ismay, I will give you 2 really wonderful quotes that he gave the Senate 112 years ago. And these 2 quotes, they're kind of related, even though one comes from day 1 of the inquiry and one comes from day 11. They're both overarching looks at the inquiry as a whole. They feel prepared. These are statements that, in my mind, Bruce came into the inquiry wanting to say these. So there's a bit of preparedness here. So this first quote comes from the opening moments of the U.S. inquiry. Quote, "I would like to express my sincere grief at this deplorable catastrophe. I understand that you gentlemen have been appointed as a committee of the Senate to inquire into the circumstances. So far as we are concerned, we welcome it. We court the fullest inquiry. We have nothing to conceal, nothing to hide." Then on day 11, Bruce says something a bit more personal about his behavior. He says, "Mr. Chairman, I understand that my behavior on board the Titanic and subsequently on board the Carpathia has been very severely criticized. I want to court the fullest inquiry, and I place myself unreservedly in the hands of yourself and any of your colleagues to ask me any questions in regard to my conduct, so please do not hesitate to do so, and I will answer them to the best of my ability." So who is Bruce Ismay? For those of you who are brand new, well, we can look at his testimony. He tells us a little bit about himself in his own words, which I think is really special. That's why this whole podcast exists. I think the words of the people involved are just so special, as opposed to hearing a historian tell you what they read from someone who read from someone who read. So to hear what he has to say is interesting, and especially because Bruce Ismay's title is often watered down to the owner of Titanic. That's how he's always described. Bruce Ismay, he was the owner of Titanic, the coward owner who boarded a lifeboat. He's always just described as the owner, which is interesting because he describes himself as the president of the International Mercantile Marine Company, the chairman and managing director of the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, which is, of course, the White Star Line, and he describes himself as a director of the International Navigation Company. That's a lot. All you need to know is he's the president of the International Mercantile Marine Company, which was that big conglomerate that J.P. Morgan financed the creation of, and the White Star Line, the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, is the flagship of. All right, let's dig into the meat of this testimony. So we talked a lot in episode 1 about the infamous dinner party, where apparently Bruce Ismay and chairman of Harland and Wolff, Lord Pirrie, conceived the Olympic-class ships over dinner. We talked a lot about how that story is likely not true. Evidence actually points to the conception happening much earlier. But luckily for us and anyone interested in Titanic, Bruce is asked a little bit about the conception of Titanic, and he does not mention a dinner party, of course. But Senator Smith asks, who of your company directed the Harland and Wolff Company to build Titanic? Ismay answers, I did, sir. Smith asks, what did you say to them? And Ismay replies, it is very difficult for me to say what I said. It would be in a conversation with Lord Pirrie that we had decided to build the Olympic and the Titanic. So we have Ismay at least confirms that when Titanic was conceived, it was over through a conversation between him and Lord Pirrie. So at least that part of the story is very much true. Bruce goes on to describe the relationship between White Star Line and Harland and Wolff, saying, they built practically the whole fleet of the White Star Line, which is true. You definitely know this if you're a Titanic person, the infamous partnership between the White Star Line and Harland and Wolff. It goes all the way back to the founding of the White Star Line by Bruce's father, Thomas. So around the time that Thomas purchased the flag from the original White Star Line and began the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, there was a new-ish shipyard called Harland and Wolff. Now, Wolff of Harland and Wolff, his uncle was a gentleman named Gustav Schwab. Schwab was playing billiards with Thomas Ismay and offered to help finance the White Star Line if the White Star Line only built ships with Harland and Wolff. So a really great partnership for his nephew. And they did stick to it for many, many years. Very, very few ships were not built by Harland and Wolff. It gets a little confusing because when J.P. Morgan steps in and the IMM is created, a lot of ships from other lines become White Star Line ships, and those ships weren't necessarily built by Harland and Wolff. Other ships, there's like a barge at some point that technically Harland and Wolff didn't build. So it gets a little complicated, but to just say practically the entire fleet was built by Harland and Wolff makes sense, and that is the words that Bruce uses. They built practically the whole fleet of the White Star Line. So these companies worked together for decades, and they would work together for decades following the sinking of Titanic. But how did they work together? What was the process of building and designing these ships? Well, Bruce gives us a bit of insight there, saying, Harland and Wolff prepare the plans. They are then submitted to us, the directors of the White Star Line, or to the manager of the White Star Line. They are carefully gone through with the representatives of the builders. They try to make suggestions to improve those plans. They are taken back and thoroughly thrashed out again, and they are submitted. I should be afraid to say how often. You see, when you build a ship, you have to start building her probably 5 or 6 years before you want her. At a few moments during Bruce Ismay's testimony, the senators ask details about the finances of things and how much Titanic cost, how they determined how much it would cost. And Bruce says two things that have been well documented, well repeated in documentaries and books and such, but it's a fascinating concept. Just listen to this. The ship was built in Belfast. She was the latest thing in the art of shipbuilding. Absolutely no money was spared in her construction. She was not built by contract. She was simply built on a commission. And then 10 days later, he sort of repeats himself, but in a bit more detail. He says, "We have never built a ship with Harlan and Wolff by contract at all. They have carte blanche to build the ship and put everything of the very best into that ship. And after they have spent all the money they can on her, they add on their commission to the gross cost of the ship, which we pay them." This is fascinating. A business agreement where one company kind of just has the freedom to do whatever they want and make whatever money they would like on it. It's a bit of trust that maybe you wouldn't see today. But I will say Alexander Carlyle has testimony in the UK, in the British inquiry, where he does clarify that while that is true, everything I just read, they could only build a ship so grand and large as the line wants, and they couldn't do literally anything. They did have to ask permission pretty much constantly, and as Ismay just described, they have to go back and forth and approve this, approve that. So yes, money is not an object, but at some point, the White Star Line would say to stop. We now get to probably the most fascinating part of Bruce Ismay's American testimony, and that is his description of why he was on board Titanic and the fact that he was a passenger only. He was not a member of the crew. He had no special access to anyone or anything. He's already in these quotes here. He's already fighting for his life. Already in 1912, newspapers are being printed and are flying off the shelves because of this story that he is a coward, that he pushed the ship to be faster and faster and faster. Potentially the exact same reason that you are listening to this episode of this podcast might be because of that narrative that he was a coward. And we'll talk about what I think of the whole coward thing later at the end of the episode. But already in 1912, these stories are beginning. And here we are in 2024, and we have things like the 1997 movie where he's the villain again. We have clickbait articles about him being a coward and whatnot. In fact, last year when I was in Halifax visiting the Fairview Lawn Cemetery for the first time, this is the cemetery where quite a few Titanic victims are buried, I overheard a tour guide describing Bruce Ismay as an absolute coward. So it's still there. There are people on this planet who believe that narrative is completely true. Here he is already defending himself. He was asked why he was on board Titanic. Bruce says, quote, "I had no business to bring me to New York at all. I simply came in the natural course of events, as one is apt to in the case of a new ship, to see how she works, and with the idea of seeing how we could improve on her for the next ship which we are building." And they were building a ship at this moment, a little ship called Britannic, the final sister ship of Olympic and Titanic. So he has a very good reason to do so. So Bruce really does involve himself in the day-to-day of the White Star Line, trying to keep his father's legacy going, which I think is pretty cool. And he's not the only one. Harlan and Wolff send an entire group of its staff to be on board the ship. They're known as the Guarantee Group. They're a group of gentlemen from various disciplines around the yard, and Ismay mentions them here. He says, quote, "I think there were probably 3 or 4 apprentices on board from Harlan and Wolff's shipbuilding yard who were there to right any small detail which was wrong. A door might jam, or a pipe might burst, or anything like that, and they were there to make it good at once." I should add here that there were actually 9 members of the guarantee group, though Ismay may be thinking of the 3 members that were traveling in first class with him. He seems unaware that there were other members of the guarantee group traveling in second. Speaking of, it's interesting that Ismay mentions the guarantee group. Like Ismay, they were traveling aboard Titanic on official business, more or less, but were technically passengers. But unlike Ismay, they do not board a lifeboat, and all 9 members of the guarantee group go down with their ship. So not a comparison Ismay will want to draw. Bruce goes on to describe in detail his relationship to the crew and to the captain in these 3 quotes. I was never outside the first-class passenger accommodations on board the ship, sir. I never went in any part of the ship that any other first-class passenger had not a perfect right to go to. Another quote. It was absolutely out of my province. I am not a navigator. I was simply a passenger on board the ship. And then a final quote. I was never in the captain's room the whole voyage over, sir, and the captain was never in my room. I never had any conversation with the captain except casual conversations on deck. I was never on the bridge until after the accident. So you can see Bruce is already laying the groundwork for his defense, for his involvement in this disaster, that he was just a passenger. But now we move on to Bruce talking about the safety of Titanic. We know that Titanic sank on her maiden voyage in a bit of sort of historic bad luck. But all in all, she was one of the safest ships ever built, certainly at the time. And in a lot of ways, her design would pass certain safety regulations today. But he goes into some detail here. He says, quote, the ship was specially constructed so that she would float with any 2 compartments full of water. I believe there are very few ships today of which the same can be said. He continues later, quote, we were very anxious indeed to have a ship which would float with her 2 largest watertight compartments full of water. What we wanted to guard against was any steamer running into the ship and hitting her on a bulkhead, because if the ship ran into her broadside on and happened to hit her right on a bulkhead, that would open up 2 big compartments. And we were anxious to guard against the possibility of that happening. And the Olympic and Titanic were so constructed that they would float with the 2 largest compartments full of water. Senator Smith asks him later on, from your experience in building ships or in authorizing their construction, and from your knowledge of that profession or trade, would you regard a collision on a bulkhead opening 2 compartments as the most serious damage she was likely to encounter? Ismay answers, yes, sir. This is a huge quote to hear because people want to know what the fatal flaw is. You'll see entire documentaries sold about fatal flaw this and fatal flaw that. They want to know that the steel was weak or the rivets were weak, or the binoculars weren't in the crow's nest, or Ismay was the reason he pushed the ship to go too fast. People want to have a fun and an exciting and dramatic way to explain terrible things like the Titanic disaster. But the truth is, it was just an anomaly of crazy circumstances. No ship in history up to this point has gone through 300 feet of damage along the entire side of a ship, at least none that we know of. And since Titanic, it also hasn't really happened since. So we have a world where this is, according to Bruce, this is the worst damage that you could consider happening. If a ship was a 2-compartment ship, she should be essentially unsinkable. And what's funny is Titanic is actually a 3-compartment ship because any 3 could open, and extremely close to being a 4-compartment ship. There are a few spots where 4 compartments could fill and she would still not sink. So they're not expecting an iceberg to open 5 compartments and honestly somewhat 6 compartments. And here is proof of it. Ismay saying that the most serious damage she was likely to encounter was 2 compartments opening because of a collision with another ship. That is unreal. Now Bruce is going to touch on a very important topic, and that is the stem-on theory that if Titanic had not turned either direction and just rammed the iceberg head-on, that the ship would not have sunk. A lot of the survivors are asked this question, or at least the people with the shipbuilding knowledge are asked of this question, which is fascinating because to this day, people ask me that question all the time. Anytime I'm out for RMST at an exhibit, talking to a newspaper, whatever, I always get asked, is it true that she could have hit the iceberg head on? And so Ismay is asked this, and he does say, if this ship had hit the iceberg stem on, in all human probability, she would have been here today. But he clarifies 10 days later, saying, quote, I think it would have taken a very brave man to have kept his ship going straight on an iceberg. I think he should have endeavored to avoid it. I'm so glad he clarifies this because, yes, to answer the question, perhaps she would have stayed afloat. It is technically possible, but who in their right mind would see an iceberg and not try to avoid it? So to me and to Bruce, it's sort of a moot point. Now, Bruce is asked here briefly about lifeboats, and this is a huge topic for this inquiry. It's one of the main things they want to get into is the lifeboats, were there not enough? How are they deployed? What can we do to fix this problem? And he is asked about lifeboats, and he gets a little, from what I'm taking from this, he gets a little feisty. In the testimony, he's getting asked, question after question after question, and then they bring up the lifeboats, and they kind of go after him with the lifeboats, and he says, she had sufficient boats to obtain her passenger certificate, and therefore she must have been fully boated according to the requirements of the English Board of Trade, which I understand are accepted by this country. Is that not so, General? So I'm sure he said it much more calm. I'm sure he was perfectly businesslike and British about it. They ask him, was the ship up to standard? And he's like, of course it was. We wouldn't have been able to leave if we didn't pass all of the government's regulations, which are accepted here. So if you have a problem with this, you shouldn't be talking to me. You should be talking to the British Board of Trade, which is true. Very, very, very true. So the senators will now move on to talk about speed. They'll talk to Bruce about speed quite a lot because, again, the rumors going around are that he was the one pushing for the ship to go faster to break records. That's something that you may actually believe about Titanic at this moment. Maybe a shock to hear that not only was Titanic not trying to beat a speed record, the owners and builders and operators of Titanic, crew of Titanic, everyone knew she couldn't beat the record if she tried. She wasn't designed to beat a speed record. So that's literally not possible. So the next explanation is, well, they were trying to break Olympics speed record. But this is what Ismay has to say about that. He's asked about that exact topic, and he says, quote, we did not expect the ship to make any better speed than the Olympic. Plain and simple. He then goes into more detail explaining what speed Titanic had at various points. Now, he describes Titanic's speed in revolutions, as in revolutions of the propellers, and that's how the crew would have talked about it. To say that Titanic was going 20 knots is complicated because that takes into account the wind, the currents, and whatnot. Revolutions are absolute. You can set the revolutions of the propellers, and then the currents and the wind get brought into play here. But if you just talk about revolutions, it just keeps things simple. Thanks to testimony in the British inquiry, we know that 75 revolutions per minute translates to about 22 knots, which, if you'd like to know, is about 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers per hour. For those familiar with Titanic the musical, there is a song in the first act called Barrett's Song, sung by Frederick Barrett. And at the end of the song, he declares, faster and faster we watch as we gain ever more. 73, and too soon it is 74. For this record speed, I believe we strive for a maiden trip that's too hard to drive. If you push her faster, than 75. So Barrett is actually speaking in revolutions. For those unfamiliar with Titanic the musical, this is your official order to change that. She left Southampton at 12 o'clock. She arrived in Cherbourg that evening, having run over at 68 revolutions. We ran from Cherbourg to Queenstown at 70 revolutions. After embarking the mails and passengers, we proceeded at 70 revolutions. I think the number of revolutions on the second day was about 72. The third day, the revolutions were increased to 75. And then he goes on to say, "It was our intention, if we had fine weather on Monday afternoon or Tuesday, to drive the ship at full speed. That, owing to the unfortunate catastrophe, never eventuated." He goes further to say, "The Titanic being a new ship, we were gradually working her up. When you bring out a new ship, you naturally do not start her running at full speed until you get everything working smoothly and satisfactorily down below." So he's describing the same thing that we would do with a new car. You don't want to push things too fast. You want to warm it up. And that's how they did things with these ships. So to break a record on a maiden voyage wouldn't be advisable anyway. And Ismay confirms this by saying, quote, "What we had arranged to do was that we would not attempt to arrive in New York at the lightship before 5 o'clock on Wednesday morning. There was nothing to be gained by arriving at New York any earlier than that." All right, let's talk about iceberg warnings. Bruce Ismay, while a member of the passenger list, not a member of the crew, had a bit of experience with the iceberg warnings, which is the one thing that you really can't take away from the whole villain theory about Bruce, is that he did kind of know a bit more about the iceberg warnings than your average passenger would. He says, quote, "I know ice had been reported." He says that in the inquiry. I know ice had been reported. He also said, "I knew that we would be in the ice region that night sometime." And when asked, "Did you have any consultation with the captain?" he says, "Absolutely none." So he just knew that ice existed. And Senator Smith asks him an interesting question that he dodges. He says, "Would you not regard it as an exercise of proper precaution and care to lessen the speed of a ship crossing the Atlantic when she had been warned of the presence of ice ahead?" Ismay says, "I am afraid that question I cannot give any opinion on. We employ the very best men we possibly can to take command of these ships, and it is a matter entirely in their discretion." That is just his party line throughout, is, look, I was not a member of the crew. Captain Smith was our most respected captain, most experienced, with the clearest record possible. It was his call what they did with the ship. But as I said, Ismay's involvement in the iceberg warnings cannot be ignored, particularly this story. It had come out aboard Carpathia during the voyage to New York. And it had been relayed to the Senate subcommittee that Ismay, at one point during Titanic's voyage, almost proudly showed off an iceberg warning to a group of passengers. He just pulled out a Marconigram out of his pocket and showed it off. And that Marconigram warned of ice. That very night, Titanic sinks. So, of course, Ismay is asked about this. One of the senators asks, "What happened to this telegram?" Ismay explains, "I handed it back to Captain Smith. I should think about 10 minutes past 7 on Sunday evening. I was sitting in the smoking room when Captain Smith happened to come in the room for some reason. What it was to do, I do not know. And on his way back, he happened to see me sitting there and came up and said, 'By the way, sir, have you got that telegram which I gave you this afternoon?' I said, 'Yes.' I put my hand in my pocket and said, 'Here it is.' He said, I want to put it up in the officer's chart room.' That is the only conversation I had with Mr. Captain Smith in regard to the telegram. When he handed it to me, he made no remark at all." The senator goes on to ask Bruce, "What did the message say that you had in your pocket?" And he says, "I am not certain. I did not pay any particular attention to the Marconi message. It was sent from the Baltic, which gave the position of some ice." So Bruce had an iceberg warning for ice that will trigger the most famous disaster in shipping history. He had it in his pocket. He did give it to the captain, who assumably put it in the chart room. So, no harm, no foul, sort of. Obviously, much harm to come. But in terms of him having it in his pocket, not a huge deal. But why did he have it in his pocket? As I said, this is one thing that Bruce really can't escape. He can say all he wants that he didn't speak about navigation with Captain Smith. It wasn't his province, as he says. He never pushed the ship to go faster, that he was a passenger. End of story. But captains don't give passengers iceberg warnings. So no matter how we feel about Bruce, this is a fact that we can't ignore, that Senator Smith won't ignore, and that the public in 1912 will not ignore. Now, here we are. We have reached the big night, April 14th, 1912. What did Bruce Ismay witness during the sinking? Is he really a coward that shouldn't have boarded a lifeboat? What do I think of Ismay's role in this disaster after a lifetime of hearing his story? Join me next time on Witness Titanic when we reconvene for part 2 of Bruce Ismay's invaluable testimony.